My health at 34 got so bad that one day I realized I was completely out of options, and I ended up going after something I hadn't even thought about in 20 years. I'm a 34M, and I've been dealing with a serious health problem for a long time now. At first, it was manageable. I went to doctors, took medication, followed advice, and for a while things would improve enough that I could keep going. It wasn't great, but it felt like there was always another option to try. Over time, though, those options ran out. Appointments started ending with a lot of vague answers and no real plan, and that's when it started to sink in that this might not be something that gets fixed. I've tried to stay calm about it, but it's hard when you're in pain every day and no one can tell you what comes next. I kept thinking there had to be something I was missing because I couldn't accept that I'd tried everything already. That's when I started thinking about Zane, which honestly surprised me because I hadn't thought about him in years. When I was a kid, there was a song that mentioned his name, and I remember asking my dad about it. My dad didn't answer right away, but eventually told me that Zane was someone people went to when nothing else worked. He said that if it hadn't been for Zane, he wouldn't be here. Growing up, my dad would bring him up occasionally, always seriously, never like a joke. I didn't really believe in any of it back then, but I remembered how sure he sounded. Now that I'm older and out of options, that memory started to feel harder to ignore. I didn't suddenly believe in miracles or anything, but I also didn't want to live with the idea that I skipped the one thing I hadn't tried. I remembered my dad met Zane through a guy named Omar who used to work in religious courts, so I decided to start there. Finding Omar took some effort. When I finally went to his office, I immediately felt out of place. Everything about it felt comfortable and expensive, and I already felt awkward because I wasn't there for the kind of help he usually gives. At first he was friendly, but once I explained who I was and mentioned my dad's name, his attitude shifted. Not in a dramatic way, just distant. When I brought up Zane, it was clear he didn't want to talk about it. He said it was a long time ago and that he barely remembered him. I asked if Zane was really someone people believed could help when nothing else did, and after a pause he said, yes, people believed that once. Then he gave me an old address where Zane supposedly lived years ago and went back to his work. I went to the address anyway. The building was in bad shape, and most of the people there either hadn't heard of Zane or laughed like I was talking about something that didn't matter anymore. A few people remembered him and said nice things, but no one knew where he was now. Some people told me directly that I was wasting my time and should just go back to doctors. I went home feeling embarrassed and tired. For a couple of days, I tried to convince myself to let it go and accept that not everything has a solution. That didn't last long. The pain came back worse than before, and I realized I wasn't ready to stop yet. I still hadn't talked to the local religious leader in my area, someone who might at least point me in the right direction, and at this point it feels like I have to keep going, even if I don't know where it's leading. After that, I decided to talk to the local religious leader in my area. I don't even know why it took me so long to think of it, but at that point, I was just moving down a list in my head of people who might know something. His office was small and kind of cramped, more like a shop than an office, and when I walked in, he was already talking to someone else. I stood there awkwardly until the other guy left, trying not to look impatient even though I was exhausted. When he finally looked at me, his expression was pretty neutral. I explained who I was and why I was there, and when I mentioned Zane, he reacted the same way almost everyone else had. He looked surprised, like he hadn't heard that name in a long time. He told me Zane was still alive, which honestly caught me off guard, but then immediately followed it by saying no one really knows where he stays anymore. According to him, Zane moves around a lot and doesn't have a fixed place, which made the whole situation feel even more frustrating. I asked him if he personally knew where to find him, and he shook his head. He said I might run into Zane by accident, or I might search for months and never see him at all. That wasn't exactly reassuring. He could tell how bad my situation was, though, because he asked a few questions about my health and didn't rush me out the door like some of the others had. He tried to be helpful in his own way. He actually sketched out a rough map of the area and started pointing out places where Zane might show up. He told me to check cafes, prayer rooms, places where people gather late at night, even spots where beggars usually hang around. He said Zane doesn't stand out and that if you weren't looking for him, you'd probably walk right past him. Hearing that honestly made me feel worse because it sounded like like I could easily miss him even if he was right in front of me. I left with that map and spent days walking around, asking people who looked like they'd been in the area a long time if they'd heard of Zane. Most people hadn't. Some smiled politely and shook their heads. A few older shop owners remembered him vaguely and talked about him like someone from their youth, but none of them knew where he was now. A couple of people laughed and told me I was chasing something that didn't exist anymore. I didn't even argue with them. I was too tired for that. Eventually, someone suggested I talk to an old calligrapher named Hassan, who supposedly used to be friends with Zane. I went to his shop, which was small and packed with supplies, and found him working quietly. When I told him why I was there, he stopped what he was doing and looked at me like I'd just reminded him of something important. He talked about Zane like someone he'd known very well, but he also admitted he had no idea where he was now. He said Zane would show up regularly for a while and then disappear completely, sometimes for years. Hearing that didn't help much, but it did confirm that Zane was a real person and not just some story people passed around. After that, I kept searching. I walked all over the area, talked to anyone who seemed like they might know something, and followed every lead I was given. Each one ended the same way. Either the person hadn't heard of Zane in years, or they told me he might show up again someday, but not to count on it. By the end of it, I was exhausted and starting to feel stupid for how much time and energy I was putting into this. Still, I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about giving up, the pain would flare up again and remind me why I started. Eventually, someone mentioned that Zane used to spend time with a musician named Gabe who lived across town. It wasn't much, but it was the first new lead I'd had in a while, so I decided to follow it. I went to see Gabe mostly because I didn't know what else to do. By that point, I was running on very little energy and even less optimism. His place was nicer than I expected, but not in an intimidating way. It felt lived in. He welcomed me like he already knew why I was there, which honestly caught me off guard. I didn't feel like I had to explain myself too much, and that alone made me stay longer than I planned. When I mentioned Zane, Gabe didn't laugh or brush it off. He just paused and said that Zane used to visit him sometimes, but never on a schedule. He told me Zane could show up several nights in a row and then disappear for weeks or months. I asked if he had any idea where Zane was now, and Gabe said no, but that he might show up again at any time. Hearing that was frustrating, but at least it didn't feel like another dead end. Gabe mentioned a man named Warren who sometimes spent evenings at a bar downtown and who, according to him, still crossed paths with Zane occasionally. At that point, I didn't care how thin the lead was. I went to the bar that same night. It wasn't hard to spot Warren. He was sitting alone, already a few drinks in, clearly settled in for the evening. I introduced myself and told him I was looking for Zane. He barely let me finish before telling me to sit down and have a drink. I tried to explain that I wasn't really there to drink, but he shut that down immediately. He told me we weren't having a conversation unless I drank with him. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I was too tired to argue and too desperate to leave. I drank more than I should have, way more. At some point, I stopped keeping track. The room started to blur, and whatever I had planned to say completely disappeared from my head. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up slumped over the table, feeling awful and disoriented. Warren was still there looking at me with what almost seemed like concern. I noticed my head and hands were wet and asked what had happened. That's when Warren told me something that made my stomach drop. He said Zane had been sitting right next to me earlier that night. Apparently, he'd been there for a while, watching me struggle, and at some point had tried to wake me up. Then he left. I didn't even know how to react. I asked where he went, if anyone followed him, if there was any way to catch up to him. Warren said no. Zane never stayed long and never said where he was going. I felt completely drained. The one time I'd been that close, I hadn't even known it. I left the bar barely holding it together. Over the next few days, I went back a few times, hoping I'd get lucky and run into him again. It didn't happen. Warren eventually told me he was leaving town for a while, and after that I had no one else to ask. Now I'm stuck waiting. I don't know if Zane will show up again, or if I missed my chance completely. All I know is that he's real, that he was there, and that somehow I was too out of it to meet him when it mattered. I keep going back and forth between telling myself to give up and feeling like I can't stop yet. I don't know what comes next, but for now, all I can do is wait and hope I haven't already ruined my last chance.